Los Angeles, 1963. Gold Star Studios on Santa Monica Boulevard. The place smelled like cigarette smoke and old carpet. The hallways were narrow. The coffee was bad. And on any given Tuesday afternoon, you might find 3 different recording sessions happening at the same time in 3 different rooms. Musicians rotating in and out like shift workers at a factory. Nobody dressed up. Nobody made speeches. You came in, you played, you got paid, you left. Glen Campbell understood this world better than almost anyone. He was 27 years old and already had a reputation that most musicians spend a lifetime chasing. Session guitarists in Hollywood talked about him the way mechanics talk about a guy who can hear an engine problem before he opens the hood. Natural, effortless. The kind of fast that doesn't look like speed. He'd recorded with Frank Sinatra. He'd played on tracks for Nat King Cole. He was part of the loose collective of studio musicians that people would later call the Wrecking Crew, a group so good and so in demand that they quietly played on half the hits coming out of Los Angeles without most listeners ever knowing their names. Campbell didn't need the credit, he needed the work, and the work kept coming. That particular afternoon, he arrived at Gold Star for a session that started at 2. He was early, as he usually was. The control room wasn't ready yet, so he poured himself coffee from the pot that always sat on the table near the front desk. Black, lukewarm, the kind that gets made in the morning and never refreshed, and sat in the main corridor, guitar case between his feet, running through chord shapes in his head without touching the strings. He had that ability. A lot of the top session men did. You could work through a whole arrangement internally, hear where the problems were, fix them without making a sound. By the time you got into the room, the work was already mostly done. That's when he noticed the guy in the corner. Young, maybe 20, maybe a little older. Hard to tell. He was sitting in a folding chair near the far wall with an electric guitar across his lap, not plugged in, just running his fingers along the neck very slowly. Not practicing scales, not warming up for anything in particular. More like he was having a quiet conversation with it, pressing down here, shifting up there, tilting his head slightly as though listening for something only he could hear. His clothes were a bit unusual for the session circuit, brighter than what most of the guys wore, more color. In a world where everyone defaulted to jeans and a plain shirt, he stood out just enough to notice, but not enough to stop for. Campbell looked at him for maybe 3 seconds, registered. Young guitarist, waiting, probably for the same session or the one after. Nothing more. Then he looked away. The session engineer appeared in the doorway and waved him in. The Wrecking Crew world had a rhythm to it. You walked in, somebody handed you a chart or played you a rough demo, you figured out your part, and then you recorded it. There wasn't a lot of discussion. The producers wanted it clean, and they wanted it fast. And the musicians who got called back were the ones who delivered both without making a fuss. Campbell was very, very good at this. He could read a chart cold and play it like he'd rehearsed it for a week. He had instincts that other guitarists studied for years trying to develop. When something wasn't working, he knew it before the producer said anything. He'd already be adjusting, finding a different voicing, pulling back on the attack, shifting his position on the neck. Sometimes the engineer would come over the talkback and say, "That last take, can we?" And Campbell would already be nodding. Already knew. Already had the fix waiting. There was a shorthand that developed between him and the other top session players. A look across the room, a slight tilt of the head. They spoke in a private language of small gestures, and the result was music that sounded easy because all the hard work had been done quietly, invisibly, before the tape even started rolling. In this world, he was the standard. When other guitarists wanted to know where the bar was, they looked at Campbell. And that afternoon in the corridor, when he glanced at the quiet guy in the corner, he did so with the comfortable half attention of someone who has been the best in the room for long enough that they've stopped checking. He didn't ask the young man's name. There was no reason to. The guy in the corner was playing the same Los Angeles circuit that season. Small sessions, club gigs, weeknight slots at places that didn't advertise much. He was from Seattle originally, had come up through the R&B touring circuit, playing backup for acts that moved fast and paid slow. He was good. People who worked with him said so. But in Los Angeles in 1963, a lot of people were good. His name was Jimi Hendrix. At that point, nobody in the mainstream session world knew it. He wasn't on the radar yet. He was just another young guitarist working his way through a city that had more talented people per square foot than almost anywhere else on Earth. He sat in corridors. He waited. He played for himself when there was nothing else to do. And the established guys, the ones with the reputations, the ones who got called first, mostly walked past. There's a version of this story that would be simpler to tell. A version where someone stops in the hallway and listens and has a big reaction, some immediate recognition that this is different, that this is something. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, in a way, stranger. Campbell was in and out of Gold Star and the other studios over those months, and Jimi was in the same orbit, and their paths crossed more than once. A corridor here, a waiting room there, possibly the same session once or twice, though the exact dates are blurry now. Campbell heard him, almost certainly. In those close studio spaces, you heard everyone. He just didn't stop, not because Jimi wasn't doing something interesting. Looking back, from a distance of decades, it seems almost impossible that anyone could have been in that room and not felt something shift when Jimi touched the strings. But that's the thing about hindsight. It flattens everything into the shape of what we now know. In 1963, Jimi Hendrix was an unknown kid with an unusual style and no particular leverage in a city full of both. And Campbell was a man with places to be. 3 years later, everything changed. Jimi left Los Angeles for New York. Then Chas Chandler found him in a Greenwich Village club and brought him to London. And London, which had its own kind of musical hunger at that moment, understood immediately what it was looking at. By the end of 1966, the British press was losing its mind. Eric Clapton had watched Jimi play Hey Joe at a college venue and gone quiet backstage, telling his bandmates he was quitting guitar. Pete Townshend had stood beside Clapton with the same pale, stunned expression. Keith Richards had invited Jimi to a Chelsea party and ended up getting schooled in his own signature tuning. The ripples came back to America. The music press started running pieces. Are You Experienced came out in 1967. Radio started catching up. Glen Campbell heard it all. He heard Purple Haze on the radio for the first time and turned the volume up. He sat with Are You Experienced the way a reader sits with a book they can't put down, going back to certain sections, lifting the needle, playing them again. He listened to the guitar the way you listen to something that's technically in a language you know, but using words you've never heard before. The style was distinctive, ferocious in places, delicate in others, and there was something in the approach, the way Jimi used feedback as texture, the way he treated the space between notes as seriously as the notes themselves, that made Campbell feel like he was hearing questions he hadn't thought to ask. And then, somewhere in the middle of that listening, something older surfaced. A folding chair in a corridor. A guy running his fingers along a guitar neck without making sound. The flash of color in his clothes. Campbell didn't say anything about it publicly for a long time. He kept working, kept recording, kept building a career that by the late 60s had made him one of the most recognizable names in American music. Gentle on My Mind. By the time I Get to Phoenix. His own television show, his own sound, his own lane. But the memory of those hallways stayed with him. Jimi died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. The news hit the music world like a door slamming shut on a room that had been full of sound. Clapton cried. Richards went quiet for days. People who had only met Jimi once talked about it like they'd lost something personal, which in a way, they had. Campbell didn't give interviews about it right away. He wasn't that kind of person. He processed things privately, at his own pace. But in a conversation some years later, when the topic of those early Los Angeles years came up, the studio circuit, the corridor sessions, the Wrecking Crew days, he paused in a way that people who knew him recognized. It was the pause of someone choosing words carefully, not because they're hiding something, but because they're not sure they have the right words at all. He talked about the scene, the sessions, the way musicians move through that world. And then he said something like, there was a kid around in those days, quiet, sat in corners. I heard him, but I didn't really listen. Later I understood who it was. The person he was talking to asked if he regretted it. Campbell took a moment with that. Regret wasn't quite the word, he said. Regret implies you knew what you were passing on. He didn't know. That was the whole thing. He just didn't know. There's a particular kind of loss that doesn't have a clean name. Not grief, not failure. More like the feeling of holding a photograph of a moment you were present for, but somehow absent from. You were there. You just weren't paying attention. Glen Campbell was one of the best guitarists of his generation. That much is true and was always true. He built something remarkable from real talent and real work, and the music he made reached people in ways that mattered. But in those corridors, in those waiting rooms, in those stolen minutes between sessions, something else was happening in the corner of the room. A young man was playing for no audience, exploring something that the rest of the world wasn't ready to hear yet. And the best guitarist in the room didn't look up. Not because he couldn't hear it, because he already knew what he thought he'd find. That's the part that lingers, not the cruelty of it. There's no villain in this story. Just the ordinary human weight of certainty. The way knowing you're good can sometimes make you blind to what good actually looks like when it's standing quietly against a wall. Clapton had to watch Jimi play before he understood. Richards had to sit across from him with a guitar. Dylan had to hear his own song given back to him transformed. Campbell never got that moment. He had dozens of smaller moments, quiet chances in ordinary rooms, and they slipped past without announcement. Some questions don't come with answers. They just stay open. What would Campbell have heard if he'd turned and really listened that afternoon at Gold Star? What would his hands have learned? What would have changed? Nobody knows. Glen Campbell didn't know either, but he thought about it. That much was clear. He thought about it for a long time.